It began as a quiet Saturday afternoon in northern Thailand, the kind of day where the air was thick, the sun filtered dimly through the jungle canopy, and everything seemed wrapped in a humid stillness. June 23rd, 2018. No one could have imagined that the lives of 13 people, 12 boys and their football coach, were about to hang in the balance. The Wild Boars, a local soccer team made up of boys aged between 11 and 16, had just finished practice. Like they'd done before, they decided to celebrate a teammate's birthday by exploring the nearby Tam Luang Nang Non cave, a winding, vast system of limestone passages snaking beneath the Doi Nang Non mountain. It was meant to be a short adventure. In, explore a bit, leave their names on the wall, and be back out by evening. They had no way of knowing the mountain had different plans. As the team ventured deeper into the cave, a sudden downpour, unexpected, unseasonal and unforgiving, swept through the region. Rain hammered the hills, soaked the jungle, and funneled down through cracks in the rock. Water surged through the cave's narrowest points, filling chambers and cutting off exits. By the time they realized what was happening, the entrance behind them had become a torrent. Their flashlights flickered off wet stone as they turned back, only to find the way blocked. They were trapped. Are you enjoying the story? Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next video. That's how you support the Australian people on their path toward a better future. Your support means everything. Above ground, no one panicked at first. When the boys didn't return home that evening, parents assumed they had lingered somewhere. But when their bikes, backpacks and shoes were found abandoned near the cave entrance, the atmosphere shifted from concern to dread. Local police were called, park rangers arrived, then divers, then the Thai military. But the deeper they pushed, the worse the news became. The boys were nowhere to be found, and the cave was flooding by the hour. The cave wasn't just deep, it was a maze. Narrow passages, sudden drop-offs, blind corners. Parts of it ran more than 4 kilometers into the mountain, through pitch-black corridors, barely wide enough to squeeze through. Visibility underwater was zero, currents were strong, oxygen was scarce, and monsoon season was just beginning. Within 48 hours, the rescue effort had become the largest of its kind in Thai history. The Thai Navy SEALs took command, bringing in the nation's best divers and logistical teams. They pumped water, hauled oxygen tanks, mapped the passages. Volunteers from across the country, and soon across the world, arrived by the hundreds. People brought food, dug trenches, set up flood barriers, and still no contact. 6 days passed. Divers reached chamber after chamber. Each time, nothing. No footprints, no supplies, no signs of life. Hope was fading. By day 8, international experts were called in. Among them, 2 names would become central to what followed. Harris and Craig Challen, an unassuming but world-class duo from Australia. Harris was an anaesthetist from Adelaide, methodical, calm, and widely respected not just in operating rooms, but deep beneath the Earth's surface. He was also one of the world's most accomplished cave divers. Craig Challen was a retired veterinarian with a surgeon's focus and a cave diver's resolve. Together, they had spent years exploring Australia's tightest, most dangerous cave systems. But this was no hobbyist dive, this was different. When they received the call from the British divers leading the deep search effort, they understood immediately. This wasn't a rescue, not yet. First, they had to find the boys. Then came the hard part. On July 2nd, day 10 of the search, the impossible happened. 2 British divers, Rick Stanton and John Valanthan, found them. More than 4 kilometers inside the cave, perched on a rock ledge in a chamber later called Nern Nom Sao, all 13 alive. The moment was recorded. It became one of the most watched clips on the internet that year. "How many of you?" the voice echoed in the darkness. 13, a boy answered. The world erupted in joy. Families collapsed in relief. Social media flooded with prayers, memes, tears, applause. But the divers didn't smile. Not yet. Because the boys had been found. but they hadn't been rescued. The journey to reach them had taken elite divers more than 6 hours through flooded, narrow passages. Some of those tunnels were no wider than a human shoulder. The boys had no diving experience. Most couldn't swim. They were malnourished, scared, and isolated in total darkness for more than a week. Even with breathing gear, the return journey might kill them. The options were grim. Wait out the monsoon, possibly months, inside a cave that could flood again at any moment. Teach the boys to dive, in zero visibility, through choke points that panicked even veteran divers. Sedate them and carry them out, fully unconscious, underwater. It was the third option that horrified and intrigued the rescuers alike. And it was that plan which brought Richard Harris and Craig Challen into the center of one of the most perilous rescue attempts in modern history. When Harris was briefed, he went quiet. He understood what was being asked: to sedate each boy, fit them with a full-face diving mask, and then have expert divers carry them out through kilometers of flooded, jagged, winding tunnel, with no ability to monitor vitals mid-transit. The idea was borderline unthinkable. No one had ever attempted anything like it, not in cave diving, not in anesthesia, not in any rescue mission, and if it failed, if even one boy woke up mid-dive, it would be catastrophic. But the rains were returning, and time was gone. That night, Harris reviewed protocols. He calculated dosages for children who had lost weight, were dehydrated, and likely suffering from hypothermia. He consulted with Thai doctors, military leaders, and international medical teams. There was no precedent, no backup plan, just one narrow, desperate possibility. Failure is not an option, someone said in the command tent. But Harris knew better. Failure was very much an option. He could see it in the math, in the risk curve, in the void. But he also knew something else. Something quieter, the thing no one dared say aloud. If we don't try, they will die. In his makeshift medical area, Harris lined up syringes of ketamine, atropine, and midazolam. The medications would be administered by him, boy after boy. They would go under one by one, and if all went perfectly, they would remain unconscious for the entire 3-hour extraction process. The responsibility was unbearable. One mistake, one miscalculation, one boy drowning inside his own mask. He almost said no, but he didn't. And neither did Craig Challen. His role would be as essential, stabilizing, coordinating, preparing routes, supporting divers, and stepping in when Harris couldn't. In private, the two men discussed the risks with sobering clarity. Challen asked him, "You ready for this?" Harris didn't answer. He just nodded. On the morning of July 8th, the operation began. The first boy sat on a dry ledge, legs pulled to his chest, eyes wide. Harris knelt beside him, spoke gently, then administered the anesthetic. The boy's body relaxed. His breathing slowed. A diver fitted a full-face mask to his head, double-checked the seal, then clipped the child to his harness. Then they disappeared into the black water. Time stopped. The world above held its breath. Would this work? Could it work? Would the boy survive the underwater transit, unconscious, through passages so tight a diver had to remove tanks just to squeeze through? 3 hours passed, and then through the murky waters near the mouth of the cave, a ripple, a flashlight, and a stretcher. The boy was out, pale, still, alive. The signal was sent. One out, breathing. Cheers erupted across the rescue camp. Journalists sprinted for satellite phones. Families dropped to their knees. But inside the cave, there was no celebration. There were still 12 more, and time was running out. The air in the staging chamber was thick, almost metallic. Every breath drawn by the rescuers echoed through stone like a drumbeat. There was no time for reflection, no moment to process what had just happened. The first boy was out, sedated, masked, and delivered through darkness by a single diver, alive. It had worked, but it had only just begun. 12 remained. Richard Harris knelt again, checking the vials of ketamine. His hands were steady, but only just. Each boy required a carefully calculated dose, tailored to body mass, condition, stress levels. Too little, and the child might wake underwater. too much, and his breathing could stop mid-transit. This was a medical procedure under the most extreme conditions imaginable, deep underground, with no resuscitation options, no monitors, no second chances. Craig Challen hovered nearby, quiet, methodical. He reviewed gear, checked regulators, re-evaluated route logistics with the dive team. He knew what most people watching from the surface did not. The cave was alive. It shifted, breathing. With each hour, water levels changed. Debris floated unpredictably. A clear route one moment might become impassable the next. The second boy sat with his back to the rock wall, trying not to cry. He had seen his teammate go limp, watched as strangers in black wetsuits carried him into the water. He hadn't seen him come back, only heard a diver whisper, "He made it." Now it was his turn. Harris crouched beside him, placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You're brave," he said softly. "You've already done the hard part. I'll be with you the whole way." But he wouldn't. Not really. Once the mask was on, once the drugs took hold, that boy would descend into blackness, into a liminal place between fear and faith, and a diver would carry him unconscious through stone and current. The medication went in. The boy slumped gently, his breath even. The mask was sealed, checked twice. A diver secured the tether, and then gone, submerged again into that hostile labyrinth. Back on the surface, rescue coordinators stood shoulder to shoulder in the operations tent, eyes glued to status boards. Above them, the skies had darkened again. The rains were returning, and everyone knew it. The pumps holding back water from the lowest parts of the cave were straining. If they failed, if the rains came fast, the escape route could be lost. Permanently. Inside the cave, Challen watched the third extraction preparation begin. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. He moved like a metronome, checking, rechecking, ensuring the second diver was ready. He wasn't just assisting, he was holding the system together with pure resolve. Without him, chaos could creep in. A missed tank, a tangled tether, a miscommunication. In this place, small things became fatal. By the end of the day, 4 boys had been brought out. Four lives that, just 2 days earlier, were all but lost. And yet, the tension did not lift, not even slightly. That night, Harris sat on a crate outside the cave entrance, under a tarpaulin shelter. The jungle around him buzzed softly, indifferent. He looked down at his hands, still trembling. The sedation had worked, the masks had held, the divers had performed flawlessly. But in the back of his mind, he replayed every risk they had taken, every variable that could have flipped the result. "We shouldn't have gotten away with this," he whispered. He thought about the parents, many of whom still hadn't seen their sons, hadn't even been told if they were among the rescued. The Thai military had imposed strict controls on information to prevent panic. Only a handful of people knew who was out and who remained inside. It had to be that way. Every rescue had to feel like the first, every procedure fresh, no assumptions, no shortcuts. Back inside the mountain, 8 boys and the coach still waited. July 9th. Dawn came slowly, a grey light pushing through a canopy choked with storm clouds. The forecast was worse. Torrential rains expected within 48 hours, maybe less. If they came early, even by a few hours, the cave system could flood completely, and there would be no more rescues. The team didn't speak of this directly, but it was in their eyes, in the urgency of their movements, in the silence between commands. Harris prepared the first sedation of the day before sunrise. This time the boy hesitated. "Will I wake up?" he asked in Thai through a translator. Harris paused. "Yes," he said, "you'll wake up safe." He didn't add what he was thinking. "I just don't know when, or how, or if I'll be there." Another mask, another seal, another tether. Another boy passed into the hands of a stranger who would carry him, breath by breath, through death's corridor. That day, 4 more were rescued. The rhythm was relentless. Sedate, mask, transport, surface, stabilize, repeat. Every diver was pushed to the edge of exhaustion. They worked underwater for hours, carrying fragile bodies through zero visibility. Every bump against a rock wall, every shift in current, every lost sense of orientation brought the risk of failure. But they didn't fail. They couldn't. One diver, a British volunteer named Jason Mallinson, later described it as the most terrifying dive of his life. You're carrying a sleeping child through pitch black with one hand on a rope and the other holding a heartbeat. At the end of day 2, 8 boys had been pulled from the depths, and still 5 remained. 4 boys, 1 coach. Night fell again over Tham Luang. The air was heavy, as if the mountain itself were holding its breath. In the command tent, Harris reviewed oxygen levels for the final chamber. The pumps were still working, but only just. A partial failure that night could trap the last group indefinitely. He stepped out into the mud and looked up. Lightning in the distance. The wind had shifted. The rain was coming. He turned to Challen. "Tomorrow's it," he said. Challen nodded. All or nothing. They didn't need to say more. Inside the hospital in Chiang Rai, the rescued boys rested in isolation. Nurses monitored vitals, administered fluids, adjusted temperature. Doctors reported signs of mild infection, dehydration, fatigue. But the boys were alive and slowly returning to the world. Their first requests: fried rice, chocolate, football scores. Still, the rescue team kept their distance. No interviews, no cameras, no ceremony. Not yet, because the cave wasn't empty. And until it was, no one would celebrate. The air pressure dropped overnight. Inside the tents surrounding Tham Luang, radios buzzed with new urgency. Rain had begun to fall during the early hours of July 10th. Not a downpour, not yet, but enough to stir every rescuer awake. The forecast was no longer a prediction, it was a countdown. If the storm advanced, the final chamber, where the 4 remaining boys and their coach still waited, would be submerged. The pumps could only hold out so long. Mudslides were now a risk, and one of the backup generators had already failed during the night. This was it. The third and final extraction operation had to succeed, and fast. By first light, the command center came alive. Maps were unrolled, ropes were reset, cylinders were checked and staged. Divers, most of them physically and emotionally exhausted, suited up without a word. Everyone knew what was at stake. This wasn't a job anymore. It was a race. Inside the cave, Richard Harris kneeled beside the first of the 4 remaining boys. The child was trembling, not with fear, but cold. After 17 days in the cave, body temperatures were dropping dangerously. The humidity made it worse. It wasn't enough to survive the water now. They had to survive the weight. Harris looked at the boy. His skin was pale. Muscles barely responded to touch. This sedation would be harder. He would need less ketamine than the others. His metabolism slower now. The margin of error had shrunk. He administered the injection slowly, eyes fixed on the boy's face, watching for signs of distress. The boy's breathing deepened, then steadied. Harris adjusted the full face mask and gave the nod. The diver clipped the tether and slipped silently into the water. Another soul submerged into a maze of stone. Craig Challen stood at the next junction, torchlight flickering on his wetsuit. He was ready. The plan today called for maximum speed and minimal noise. Every minute mattered. The rain outside was no longer hypothetical. It was falling now, slow, steady, inevitable. One by one, the final boys were sedated and guided away. By now, the process was terrifying in its familiarity. Sedate, mask, secure, dive. 3 hours in, 3 hours out. No change, no shortcuts. But even with the procedure refined, the dangers remained unchanged. One missed detail, one moment of hesitation could destroy everything. Then, disaster struck. Halfway through the final extraction, one of the main water pumps near the entrance suddenly failed. The sound was unmistakable, a grinding mechanical shriek followed by a thud, then silence. Within minutes, water levels began to rise, fast. Faster than anyone expected. Divers still inside the passage began to feel it first. Currents that had been mild were suddenly strong again. Visibility, which had slightly improved, was now reduced to zero. The incident was real. A backup pump line had ruptured under pressure. The backup to the backup wasn't ready, and the rain wasn't stopping. Word spread through the cave like lightning. "Water's coming in. We have to move now." A sense of controlled panic rippled through the command tent. The cave could flood again, trapping not just the remaining boys, but rescuers as well. For Harris and Challen, there was no retreat. They were too deep inside. The mission was already underway. If they turned back, they risked leaving unconscious children in flooded passageways, unprotected, unbreathing. There was only one option: continue. As Challen coordinated with the divers still inside, Harris prepared the coach, Ekapol, for sedation. He had insisted on being the last one out. He had barely spoken during the previous days, focused entirely on keeping the boys calm, their minds occupied, their hope alive. He had given them his food, taught them to meditate, kept them focused. Now it was his turn. Harris paused before giving the injection. There was something symbolic in this moment. Ekapol had held these children together through the darkest days, and now his life was in their hands. "Thank you," Harris said softly. The coach nodded. The sedation went in. The final diver clipped the coach to his harness. Then they vanished into the dark. Outside, the last stage of the operation unfolded under blinding rain. Helicopters stood ready to receive the final evacuees. Ambulances waited at the staging point near the cave entrance. Tension gripped the crowd. No one cheered. No one spoke. The only sounds were the hum of engines, the patter of rain on plastic tents, and the whispered prayers of volunteers kneeling in the mud. It was during these final hours that Harris and Challen reached their physical limits. Inside the cave, after the last boy had been passed along to the next diver, Harris stopped. He felt it. The wall of fatigue, the creeping tremor in his hands, the crushing weight of adrenaline withdrawal. He hadn't eaten in nearly a day. His wetsuit was cold against his back, his breathing ragged. He leaned against the stone wall alone and whispered the words that had echoed in his mind since the first injection. "Let them all make it. Please, let them all make it." Challen found him minutes later. "Let's go," he said. They moved in silence, retracing their path through the cave, this time without passengers, without masks, without the unbearable burden of human lives strapped to their chests. By the time they emerged from the final passage and stepped back into daylight, the last boy had already been airlifted. The mission was done, and yet they felt nothing. Not joy, not relief, just stillness. Because while the world celebrated, they were still processing what they had done and what they had risked. At the hospital, the final boys were treated and stabilized. All 13 were safe, weak, yes, but breathing. They were soon reunited with their families. Across Thailand, the news spread in a single phrase: "They are out." But the rescuers remained in the shadows, especially Harris. It was only after he emerged from the cave that he was told what his family had kept from him, that his own father had passed away on the day of the final rescue. He received the news with the same quiet intensity he had carried for weeks. He didn't break down. He didn't ask why they hadn't told him sooner. He just said he would have understood. The grief was personal, profound, and postponed. For now, he simply sat down, surrounded by wet gear, and looked at his hands again. This time, they weren't trembling. They were still. The rain didn't stop for 2 more days. Even after the last boy had been airlifted, even after the final diver surfaced, soaked to the bone but unbroken, the sky above Tam Luang wept, as if nature had waited, holding its breath alongside the rescuers, only to release everything once the last soul had left the cave. But inside the perimeter, there was no celebration, no champagne, no shouts of victory, just exhaustion. In the makeshift medical tent at the cave's edge, Richard Harris removed his gloves slowly, one finger at a time, as if peeling away not just latex, but the weight of every choice he'd made inside that mountain. His hands were raw, cracked from days of exposure. He blinked against the light, the real light, after days beneath rock. The lines on his face had deepened. A Thai officer approached him quietly, hesitating. Then the words came softly. "Your father passed away just after the last boy came out." Harris didn't flinch, didn't speak. He simply nodded, and then he sat down on a folding chair and stared at the ground for a long time. He didn't cry. There wasn't time. He wasn't ready to process it. Not yet. His mind was still underwater, still at the rock ledge where those boys had clung to life, still hearing their voices, still watching their faces disappear behind the masks he had fitted himself. It would take months before he understood what he had done. Maybe years, maybe never. In the city of Chiang Rai, the rescued boys lay in white hospital beds, separated from their families by glass and protocol. Their bodies were frail but recovering. They wore surgical masks to prevent infection. Nurses brought them hot broth and clean clothes. Doctors checked vitals every hour. They were monitored for leptospirosis, pneumonia, and fungal infections, real risks after 2 weeks in that environment. But day after day, the prognosis improved. One boy asked for chocolate, another for fried chicken. One wanted to see his dog. The team's coach, Ekapol, was kept in observation too. He had lost the most weight of all, more than 10 kilograms, but he had been stable, quiet, meditative. The boys said he had told them stories, led breathing exercises, kept them calm when the lights died and the water rose. They owed him more than they could understand. The doctors said they would all make a full physical recovery, but no one spoke about the dreams, or the silence, or what it would mean to walk in daylight again. Meanwhile, the story exploded. From Bangkok to Brisbane, London to Los Angeles, the headlines were the same. Miracle in the cave. They're alive. Against all odds, TV anchors wept on live broadcasts. Celebrities tweeted their awe. World leaders issued statements of praise. Journalists raced to get interviews. Film studios scrambled for rights. Netflix made calls. So did National Geographic. So did everyone. But inside the hotel room in Chiang Rai, where Richard Harris and Craig Challen had been taken for debriefing, none of that mattered. They sat in silence. No suits, no medals, no press. Just two men, tired beyond measure, unable to sleep. Challen stared at the ceiling. "We shouldn't be here," he said. Harris didn't reply. "We should have lost one, at least one." And he wasn't wrong. Every single factor in that cave had argued for tragedy. Not triumph, zero visibility, narrow chokes, fragile masks, unconscious children. It should have ended differently, but it hadn't. And now they were back in the world, expected to be heroes, to give speeches, to smile for cameras, as if what they had done hadn't taken pieces of them too. They'd left something behind in that mountain, and neither knew if they'd ever get it back. In Australia, they were called miracle workers. The Prime Minister praised their heroism. The media demanded interviews. They politely declined, at first. Then, a quiet press conference was held. Harris spoke softly. Challen answered only a few questions. When asked how they felt, Harris simply said, "It's complicated." They didn't describe the cave. They didn't describe the fear. They didn't mention the weight of sedating a child, then pushing his unconscious body through flooded rock, not knowing if he would wake up again. They left that part out. Back in Thailand, the families of the wild boars team were finally allowed brief, controlled reunions behind glass. The boys smiled, their parents wept. But even in that moment, there was distance, a gap that trauma had opened, one that no embrace could fully close. They would carry this experience into adulthood, some with pride, some with pain, all with memory. Later, the boys were visited by Buddhist monks who led prayer ceremonies to bless their survival. Gifts arrived from around the world, jerseys, letters, books, even a promise from FIFA to invite them to the World Cup final, a promise they sadly could not accept in time due to health restrictions. Still, the world had not forgotten them, and neither had Thailand. A statue was commissioned in honor of Saman Kunan, the former Thai Navy SEAL, who had died bringing oxygen into the cave. His image now stands in bronze at the mouth of Tam Luang, one knee down, tank on his back, gaze forever fixed on the path he never returned from. His death was the only life lost during the rescue, but it was not forgotten, nor forgiven. Back in Australia, Harris returned to his work at the hospital. Challen too resumed his routine. But nothing was normal. Not really. They were now recipients of the Star of Courage, the Order of Australia, and ultimately the Australians of the Year in 2019. They stood before crowds, received applause, gave speeches, all of it surreal. Harris's voice trembled during one appearance. "We were just two cogs in a very big machine," he said. "This wasn't about one or two people. This was about everyone who showed up and didn't walk away." But beneath the words, something else pulsed, a weight. They had done what had never been done. They had rewritten the rulebook of rescue, but they had also lived through 18 days of impossible choices, moral tightropes, and personal grief. And even as they were handed medals and honors, they knew the cave would never fully let them go. In private interviews, Harris would later reflect, "I still think about the boys, about whether we could have done things better, about what would have happened if even one thing went wrong." He never named the fear, but it was there, in every pause, in every breath. Challen spoke less often, but in one rare moment, when asked what stayed with him most, he said, "The silence. When you're underwater and there's just you and the boy. No sound, just your own breath. It's peaceful, but it's also terrifying. Because you know if anything changes, it's over." By the end of July 2018, the wild boars had returned to their homes. Their town, Mae Sai, welcomed them with garlands, banners, and tears. They were boys again, but not really. Something had changed. The cave had made them older, not in years, but in knowing. They gave interviews later, carefully managed by Thai authorities. Their story, their real story, was protected, at least for a while, because this wasn't just a story. It was trauma, bravery, chance. It was 13 boys who should have died, and didn't. It was the quiet man from Adelaide who sedated them with his own hands. It was the veteran diver who held their fates in his. It was 1,000 people from around the world who converged on a jungle to defy the odds, and it was one cave, dark, relentless, alive, that almost took them all. The cave was silent again. No footsteps, no diving gear, no voices, just darkness, and the memory of what had taken place inside. By the end of July 2018, weeks after the last boy had been pulled from the narrow limestone tunnel, Tam Luang had been sealed, not permanently, but as an act of reverence, a pause, a breath. The jungle around it, which had once pulsed with generators, voices, and flashing lights, returned to quiet. Trees shed water onto leaves. Monks came to bless the cave's mouth. And somewhere deep inside that mountain, time resumed its normal rhythm. But for those who had entered it, the boys, the coach, the rescuers, time would never move quite the same way again. In the weeks that followed the rescue, Thailand entered a kind of national catharsis. The story of the wild boars had unified a nation, one still reeling from political division and uncertainty. People had set aside differences. Buddhist monks, Christian pastors, Muslim clerics, and villagers of every background had gathered outside that cave and prayed together. School children had folded origami cranes. Street vendors had cooked for free. Volunteers had arrived from every corner of the country. The King of Thailand issued medals. Ceremonies were held in Chiang Rai, in Bangkok, in the smallest hamlets that had sent aid. The Thai Navy SEALs, especially those who had stayed underground with the boys, were honored as national heroes, but the loudest cheer was reserved for a man who could no longer hear it. Saman Kunan, a former Navy SEAL turned volunteer. Saman had lost consciousness during an oxygen delivery run deep in the cave. His death had rocked the rescue team. It had almost halted the operation, and now It became the human cost behind the miracle. His funeral was a state event. Tears were shed openly. A statue of Saman was soon erected at the cave's entrance, sculpted in full diving gear, flanked by depictions of the wild boars. His widow was there. So were hundreds of those who had worked beside him, soaked, exhausted, and afraid, but who had never turned back. Saman had become the soul of the rescue, and his sacrifice haunted everyone who made it out. Back in Australia, Richard Harris and Craig Challen returned to lives that no longer felt familiar. They had walked out of Tam Luang and into the center of a global story. Reporters camped outside homes, news crews lined up for interviews, invitations arrived for awards, honorary degrees, leadership summits. Offers came from publishers, filmmakers, political figures, even royalty. But neither man had come for any of that, and neither felt comfortable being called a hero. Harris, especially, carried a silence with him, the kind that settles over someone who has seen, up close, what could have gone wrong. He returned to work at the Royal Adelaide Hospital. Colleagues offered hugs, applause, respect, but Harris struggled to meet their eyes. Inside, he replayed the procedures, the weight of the syringes, the way each child's chest had risen under sedation. The pressure of hoping, not knowing, if they would still be breathing 3 hours later. He thought of the boys, of their stillness, of their trust, and of what it meant to carry a person who had given themselves entirely to you because they had no other choice. He began speaking at medical forums, not with bravado, but with brutal honesty. Everything about that plan, he told one audience, should have failed. It was a long series of risks stacked on top of each other, and somehow they all held. He didn't call it a miracle, but he never stopped being amazed that it worked. Craig Challen, on the other hand, returned to Perth with quiet dignity. A veterinarian by training, he resumed his practice part-time, but cave diving, the thing that had brought him into this story, remained his passion. He became more vocal than Harris in the months that followed, not for glory, but for education. He spoke of teamwork, of logistics, of the need for calm under pressure. And he spoke often of Harris. He made the impossible plan possible, Challen said in an interview. He carried the risk, and he did it without ego. They stood side by side when the Australian government awarded them the Star of Courage and the Medal of the Order of Australia, the country's second and third highest civilian honours. Later they were named Australians of the Year for 2019. In their acceptance speeches, they turned the spotlight outward onto the Thai people, the international diving teams, the local volunteers. This story, Harris said, belongs to everyone who refused to give up. Still, the deeper story remained largely untold. Harris never publicly described the moment he had to sedate the first boy, never detailed the second-by-second choices that separated life from death in those tunnels. Nor did Challen speak about the sheer fatigue, the moments when breath control became a guess, when the cave walls pressed in so tightly they felt like skin. The public didn't see the blisters, the hallucinations, the fear of losing your sense of direction in black water with a child strapped to your chest. They didn't see the near misses, the times a mask almost came loose, a heartbeat slowed, or a diver lost contact with the guide rope for just one terrifying moment. They only saw the victory, not the cost. Meanwhile, the wild boars returned to school. Their lives, now public property, were placed under the protection of the Thai government. A foundation was established to manage interviews, sponsorships, appearances. Psychologists were assigned. Some of the boys spoke at youth forums. Others retreated into silence. They had become symbols, but they were still children. And children don't process trauma the way adults do. Some would carry it quietly. Others would channel it into purpose. At least one would later leave Thailand to pursue schooling abroad. Another would become a novice monk for a time, in honor of the Navy SEAL who died. As for the coach, Ekapol, he remained a figure of quiet grace, Accused at first by some of recklessness, he was soon embraced as the man who had kept 12 boys alive in darkness, on scraps of food and hope. His training as a former monk, the breathing techniques, the stillness, had made survival possible. He stayed close to the team, but kept his thoughts mostly to himself. In late 2019, Netflix secured exclusive rights to the team's story. The platform began developing a scripted series. Documentaries followed from National Geographic, BBC, ABC Australia. Each offered a new perspective. Each added more context, but none could capture the totality. Because the story of Tham Luang wasn't just about the rescue, it was about what happens after, when the cameras leave, when the heroes go home, when the boys wake up from dreams of cold water and realize it wasn't a dream, when the men who saved them tried to explain what it felt like to risk everything on a theory and watch it succeed, and when the world, having celebrated, moves on. But the cave does not. For Harris, the question was never whether he'd go back in time and do it again. He would, but the real question, the one he asked himself in quiet moments during long walks or late shifts at the hospital, was simpler. Why him? Why had his training, his medical background, his diving expertise, his entire life aligned perfectly with a rescue 6,000 kilometers away, in a cave he had never seen, for children he had never met? And why had it worked? Why had every needle found the right vein? Why had every boy survived? He never answered it out loud, but he thought about it often. Craig Challen gave a speech at a leadership summit one year after the rescue. He stood before CEOs, athletes, military veterans. He said this: "Courage isn't loud. It's not standing in front of cameras or walking into danger. Courage is doing the thing you're most afraid of, and doing it anyway because someone's life depends on it." The room was silent. Then applause. But even with the accolades, the medals, the attention, both men knew something the rest of the world did not. That inside that cave, during those 18 days, they had been changed permanently. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way, not into heroes, but into men who had touched the edge of something vast and unknowable, and had come back from it carrying more than anyone could see. The cave remains closed, not permanently, but symbolically. Each year, when monsoon season approaches, officials seal the entrance to Tham Luang Nang Non for safety, for respect, and maybe quietly, because some places, even when silent, are still speaking. Tourists come now, pilgrims too. They take photos near the statue of Saman Kunan, bowing their heads, some lighting incense, others simply staring. They look at the cave mouth as if waiting for something to emerge, but nothing does. The wild boars are long gone. Richard Harris and Craig Challen have returned to their lives, and the mountain, at last, is still. But what lives on is the story. A story told not in headlines or by streaming deals, but in the quiet memory of what it cost to do the impossible and succeed. Harris never sought out the spotlight, and when it found him, he never stayed in it for long. He continued his work as an anesthetist in Adelaide, treated patients, trained doctors, gave talks on crisis medicine and risk tolerance. But privately, he carried the weight of decisions that still felt too big to name. In one talk, when asked what scared him most in the cave, he gave an answer that surprised everyone. It wasn't the water, he said. It wasn't the pressure or the dark. It was the moment just before I gave the first injection. That breath between knowing what I was about to do and doing it. I don't think I've ever felt so alone. That moment became the essence of the story. Not the heroism, not the miracle, but the silence before action, the breath before faith, the choice to try, even when you might fail. Craig Challen continued diving, not for thrill, but for clarity. He revisited caves in Western Australia, often alone, often without fanfare. He said it helped him stay grounded, reminded him that the world doesn't revolve around events, but choices, small, quiet choices, made in the dark, far from applause. In interviews, he rarely used the word rescue. He preferred operation. Because to him, what they had done wasn't about emotion. It was about planning, about teamwork, about doing your part without needing to be thanked for it. But even he admitted later that sometimes, in dreams, he found himself back there, in the narrow corridor, with the weight of a child in his arms and the sound of nothing but his own breath. The wild boars moved on in different directions. Some resumed football, some didn't. They appeared together publicly only a handful of times, once at a global youth summit, once in a brief visit to Argentina, and once during a symbolic return to the cave. They were met with cheers, but also with cameras, always the cameras. They smiled, but no one really asked what the silence felt like. Netflix released its dramatized miniseries in 2022, Thai Cave Rescue, with cooperation from the boys and their families. It was respectful, poetic, and yet even then viewers knew this story could never be fully captured, because no script can reproduce the smell of cave air or the chill of water on skin that hasn't seen sun in 2 weeks, or the weight of a mask on a sedated child's face as you guide him, breath by breath, toward the light. Only those who were there know, and they speak of it rarely. In 2023, 5 years after the rescue, Harris and Challen were interviewed together on stage in Sydney. The moderator asked, "Do you believe in fate?" Harris paused. "I believe," he said carefully, "that everything we did in our lives, the diving, the medicine, the failures, brought us to that moment. And in that moment, we were the only ones who could have done it. That's not fate, that's preparation, meeting a nightmare," Challen added, "and the choice to walk into it anyway." They didn't elaborate. They didn't need to. Perhaps that is what makes the Thai Cave Rescue endure. Not just as a story of survival, but as a story of choice. The boys chose to stay calm. The coach chose to give them everything. The rescuers chose to try the impossible. And 2 Australians, far from home, chose to bear the unbearable, not because they wanted to, but because no one else could. Today, a museum near the cave tells the story in artifacts and still images. There's a replica of the chamber, the names of the divers, a mock-up of the guide rope. Tourists file through hushed, reverent, but outside, the real memorial is simpler, a trail that leads toward the cave, a statue of a diver with no face, and a mountain that now sleeps again, still, dark, unknowable, and sacred. There are no final words for a story like this, only echoes, only breaths held, then released, only boys who lived and those who helped them, only choices made in the dark that changed the course of everything. And the quiet certainty that somewhere, beneath the earth, a place remembers. Even if we move on, it remembers, and so do we. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next video. That's how you support the Australian people on their path toward a better future. Your support means everything.